Welcome to Whisper's Secrets. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell. Let's start. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, tucked between a water bill and a grocery store flyer. It looked so ordinary that when Thomas Reed first pulled it from the mailbox of his modest two-story house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, he didn't think much of it, just another piece of mail to be opened while sipping coffee at the kitchen table after mowing the lawn. But it was the return address, one of those DNA testing companies his youngest daughter, Katie, had badgered him into trying for fun last Christmas, that made him hesitate. He smiled to himself, remembering her enthusiasm, how she had insisted they all swab their cheeks after dinner, laughing as she teased him about finding some royal bloodline or a secret ancestor who rode with Jesse James. He had gone along with it, not because he cared about genealogy, but because it made her happy. Because everything he did was for his family, for the wife he had loved since high school, and the 3 children he had raised with calloused hands and an unshakable heart. Thomas tore the envelope open without ceremony, expecting a dry report of English and German roots, maybe a surprise Irish strain, something to joke about at Sunday dinner. But as he unfolded the crisp paper and scanned the first few lines, the air seemed to thicken around him. The words swam and then slammed into focus. No biological relationship detected with submitted offspring samples. For a moment, he thought he must be reading it wrong, that there had been a mistake, a mix-up at the lab. But the names were right: Katie, Alex, and Ben, listed neatly below, each accompanied by the same damning phrase. No biological relationship detected. The coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the linoleum floor, hot liquid splattering across his boots. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just sat there, staring at the paper, feeling as though the earth itself had shifted under his feet. In that long, echoing moment, 40 years unraveled inside him. Sleepless nights rocking colicky babies, baseball games and ballet recitals, late-night emergency room visits for broken arms and high fevers, endless small sacrifices and quiet triumphs that had built his life brick by brick, each memory twisted now, poisoned by the realization that the blood he had spilled, the sweat he had given, had not been for his blood at all. Thomas sat there until the afternoon sun slanted low through the kitchen window, painting everything in gold and dust. Finally he stood, legs unsteady, and walked like a sleepwalker through the familiar rooms of the house he had built with his own hands. Every creaking floorboard, every peeling paint chip suddenly unfamiliar, mocking. He found himself standing in the doorway of the living room, staring at the row of family photographs lining the mantel, the smiling faces, the graduation caps, the wedding portraits. A deep, hollow ache swelled in his chest, a grief too vast for tears. It was there, clutching the letter like a death certificate, that Mary came home, bustling through the door with grocery bags cradled in her arms, her voice light and cheerful as she called out a hello. When she saw him standing there, silent and still, the smile faltered on her face, replaced by a frown of concern. Thomas held out the letter without a word, watching her read it. Watching the blood drain from her face. Watching the tremble start in her hands. He knew then, without her speaking a single word, that it was true. The rage that surged up in him was blinding, not loud, but cold, precise, a knife's edge slicing through 40 years of love and loyalty. He turned without a word and walked out the door, out into the fading light, down the cracked sidewalk of the neighborhood where they had raised their children, built their lives, forged their dreams. He kept walking, past the school where he had coached Little League, past the church where they had baptized each child, past the diner where he and Mary had shared milkshakes as teenagers and promised each other forever, until his legs gave out, and he sank onto a bench in the empty town square. The paper crumpled in his fist as he sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon and the streetlights flickering to life. The weight of betrayal settled over him like a burial shroud, and he thought about all the moments that had defined his life, the whispered prayers over sleeping infants, the cheers from the bleachers, the proud tears at graduations, and realized they had been real. They had mattered. And yet, now, they were hollowed out by the knowledge that the bond he thought was forged in blood had been built on a lie. Thomas buried his face in his hands and let the night swallow him whole, Because there are some betrayals so deep they do not scream or rage, they simply consume. And sitting there in the empty town square, he knew with a sickening certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Not his marriage, not his family, not the man he had been. The road ahead, whatever it looked like, would be a road he walked alone. Thomas Reed didn't remember walking back to the house that night. His legs carried him on autopilot through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, the crumpled letter still there, damp with sweat and rain. The stars above were blotted out by a thick ceiling of clouds, and the cold gnawed at his fingers, but he welcomed it. It was something real. Something that hurt in a way he could understand. When he reached the house, he didn't go inside. He sat on the front porch, on the old wooden swing he had hung himself the summer Katie was born, and listened to the creak of the chains in the wind. The porch light was still burning. Mary must have left it on for him, the way she always did. The thought sent a fresh spike of anger through his gut. He didn't know how long he sat there before the door creaked open. Mary stepped out, hesitated on the threshold. She looked small somehow, diminished, her hands twisting nervously in the hem of her sweater. "Tom," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Please come inside. Let's talk. Talk." As if words could patch over 40 years of betrayal. He stood slowly, the swing groaning behind him. For a moment he thought about walking past her, about disappearing into the night for good. But some grim sense of duty, or maybe morbid curiosity, pulled him through the door. Inside, the house felt stifling. The air smelled of something sweet and cloying, like roses left too long in a vase. Mary followed him into the living room, wringing her hands. Thomas stayed standing, looming in the center of the room like a statue cut from old stone. "I never meant for it to happen like this," she said finally, her voice thin and brittle. "It was so long ago, Tom. It doesn't mean—" "Don't," he said, voice low and harsh. "Don't you dare tell me what it does or doesn't mean." Mary flinched. Her eyes filled with tears, but Thomas felt nothing. No sympathy. No softening. Only a cold, hollow ache that had settled into his chest and refused to leave. "I need to know," he said. "Who?" She opened her mouth, closed it, shook her head helplessly. It doesn't matter. He's long gone. He didn't want anything to do with me. With them. That's not what I asked?" She sank into the armchair, covering her face with trembling hands. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock Thomas had repaired so many times over the years. "He was someone I knew before you," she said finally. "Before we got serious. Before we decided to get married. It was one night, Tom. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And then you came back from college, and you asked me to marry you, and it felt like a chance to start fresh." Thomas stared at her, feeling the words batter against him like hailstones. He remembered that summer, the long evenings sitting on her parents' porch, the way she smiled at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. It had all been a lie. "And after that?" he asked, voice tight. "After you knew?" "I didn't know right away," she said quickly. "I swear, Tom. I didn't know for sure. And once the babies came, it didn't seem to matter anymore. You were their father. You were always their father." Thomas laughed, a bitter, broken sound that didn't even sound like him. "But it wasn't my blood," he said. "Was it?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He turned away, fist clenched so tight his knuckles cracked. "I need some time," he said. "I need to think." He didn't look back at her as he left. He stayed that night in his truck, parked in the empty lot behind the grocery store. The heater didn't work well, and the cold seeped into his bones. He didn't sleep. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the condensation freezing on the windshield, his mind running in endless circles. He thought about the years, decades, he had poured into that family. The long hours at the machine shop, the weekends sacrificed to overtime, the second mortgage he had taken out so Katie could go to college debt-free. He thought about Mary sitting at the kitchen table late into the night, balancing checkbooks and clipping coupons, the kids fighting over the TV remote, the family trips crammed into the old station wagon. All of it. Every moment. Had it all been built on a lie? And yet, when he thought about Alex's first baseball game, the way Ben had clung to his leg when he was scared of thunderstorms, the way Katie had called him, Daddy, with such pure, unfiltered joy, how could those things be false? How could they not be real? He wiped a hand over his face, rough with 2 days' worth of stubble. By morning, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. He wasn't going to forgive Mary, not yet, maybe not ever. But the kids, they were still his. Blood or not, they were his. They always had been. And he wasn't going to lose them too. Thomas moved into a cheap motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, 1 room, a sagging mattress, a shower that barely spit out warm water, but it was his. It was enough. He found work at the lumber yard, hauling planks and loading pallets. It was hard, brutal work, but it filled the hours and left him too tired to think. Katie called first. She left a message on his burner phone, her voice thick with tears. Dad, please. We didn't know. We never knew. Please don't shut us out. Alex called next, then Ben. Each message chipped away at the walls he was trying to build around himself. He didn't answer. Not yet. He couldn't. He needed time. He needed to figure out who he was now, without the life he thought he had. On Sundays, Thomas drove out to the lake just outside town. He would sit on the weathered picnic tables and watch the water shimmer under the afternoon sun. Sometimes he would bring the photo album Katie had given him, flipping through the pages slowly, carefully, like touching something sacred. The memories hurt. God, they hurt. But they were his. No one could take that from him. One Sunday, he found himself not alone. Katie stood a few feet away, clutching a thermos in both hands. She didn't speak. She didn't come closer. She just stood there, waiting. Thomas watched her for a long moment before nodding once, a small, tired gesture. She crossed the distance between them and sat down at the table, setting the thermos between them like a peace offering. I brought coffee, she said, voice barely above a whisper. The good kind? From the diner. Thomas smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile. They sat in silence, sipping the too-hot coffee, the photo album open between them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Not the life he had lost. Not the dream he had built. But something else. Something harder, smaller, but real. Something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were not a healing, not a sudden mending of broken things, but a slow, grinding endurance. Thomas Reed settled into a life pared down to its essentials: work, sleep, and the occasional long, lonely drive out to the lake. The motel room became a second skin, small, suffocating, but familiar in its blankness. No pictures on the walls. No reminders of who he used to be. Just a battered duffel bag, a thermos of coffee, and the rhythmic drone of local news channels he never really listened to. He kept working at the lumber yard. The days were brutal, splinters under his nails, muscles aching, the sun beating down on him like judgment. But it suited him. Pain, at least, was honest. It didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Each heavy load he lifted was a reminder that he was still here, still standing, even if he didn't know exactly why. Katie visited him every Sunday. At first, it was just small things. Dropping off a clean set of shirts she had bought at the outlet mall. Leaving a thermos of diner coffee outside his door if he wasn't in. Then sitting with him, sometimes in silence, sometimes telling small stories about her week, things about work, about the nephews he had never met, about the mundane, everyday world he had abandoned without even realizing he had needed to leave it. He said little. He listened more. He watched her gestures, so familiar it hurt, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she chewed her lip when she didn't know how to say something. She was his daughter. Blood or not. No revelation could erase the simple, stubborn truth that she was his. But trust was something else. It wasn't a light switch. It couldn't simply be flipped back on because she wanted it, because he wanted it. Trust had to be built again, one painful brick at a time. And Thomas wasn't sure if he had the strength to build anything anymore. One Wednesday evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. It was from Ben. "Dad, I know you probably don't want to see me. I get it. But we're doing a cookout on Saturday. Katie's idea. Nothing fancy. Just burgers and beer. If you want to come, no pressure." Thomas stared at the paper for a long time, his heart pounding with something he didn't recognize, fear, maybe, or hope, or some unholy combination of the two. He folded the note carefully, slid it into his pocket, and drove back to the motel, where he sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling until the sun went down. A cookout. Such a simple thing. Such an impossibly hard thing. He hadn't seen Ben or Alex since the truth had detonated in his life. Hadn't seen the boys he had taught to ride bikes, to bait hooks, to throw a proper punch. The boys he had thought would carry his name, his legacy, his blood into the world beyond him. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he wasn't going. And yet, when Saturday rolled around, he found himself driving slowly through the winding streets of Cedar Falls, past the old ball fields, past the crumbling elementary school, past the church with the crooked steeple. Every turn was a knife in the ribs, every familiar landmark a memory he wasn't ready to face. When he pulled up in front of Katie's house, he almost turned around. But then he saw Josh, Katie's oldest, racing across the lawn, his sneakers flashing in the sun, a football tucked under his arm. He was laughing, pure and wild and unbroken. And for just a moment, Thomas saw Alex at that age. Saw Ben. Saw himself. He shut off the engine and got out of the truck. The backyard was full of noise, kids squealing, dogs barking, music drifting from a tinny speaker set on the deck. Thomas stood at the edge for a long moment, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, feeling like a ghost at his own funeral. Then Katie spotted him. Her face lit up in a way that nearly undid him. She crossed the yard quickly, weaving between the lawn chairs and folding tables, and when she reached him, she didn't say anything. She just hugged him, hard, and he let her. Ben came over next. His face was tight, uncertain, older than Thomas remembered it being. He stuck out his hand. Thomas hesitated for a breath, then shook it. Alex arrived last. He didn't say anything at all. Just clapped his father on the shoulder with a heavy hand and gave him a look that spoke volumes. Gratitude, sorrow, apology, all wrapped up in the silent language of men who had loved and hurt, and somehow survived it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of smoke and laughter and stories that didn't quite fit the way they used to. Thomas sat in a folding chair under the oak tree, a paper plate balanced on his knee, and listened as his children, talked and argued and teased each other. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was something. And maybe that was enough. That night, back in the motel room, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling. The smell of smoke clung to his clothes, to his hair. His hands still ached from the long afternoon of tossing a football, grilling burgers, lifting grandkids high into the air while they screamed with delighted terror. It hurt. It hurt in a way that was almost unbearable. But it was a good hurt. A real hurt. A hurt that meant he was still alive. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way forward. Not back to the life he had lost, that was gone, and he would never get it back, but forward into something new, something smaller and rougher and less certain, but no less real. He closed his eyes and thought about Katie's hand in his, about Ben's clumsy handshake, about Alex's heavy hand on his shoulder. Family. Not built on blood. Built on love. And Thomas Reed, for all his broken pieces, decided that was enough. Maybe it had always been enough. The next few months blurred into a quiet rhythm, different from anything Thomas Reed had known before. The motel room still served as his home base, a cramped and peeling place where he kept his work boots by the door and a battered thermos of coffee by the bed, but it no longer felt like exile. It felt temporary. Transitional. Like a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was slowly becoming. Katie made a point of visiting him every week, often with Josh and his younger sister in tow. Ben and Alex came by too, not always together, but often enough. They never pressured him to move back, never asked him to forgive Mary. They seemed to understand instinctively that some wounds couldn't be mended by simple proximity or pretty words. Trust had to be earned again, rebuilt with care and patience. Thomas appreciated that more than he could say. He began attending Sunday dinners at Katie's house. At first, he felt like a stranger sitting at a table he had helped build in a life he no longer owned, but little by little, those awkward silences filled in with laughter, with stories, with the clatter of silverware and the shrieks of grandkids racing through the hallways. Sometimes he caught Katie watching him with that cautious, hopeful look, the one that said she was waiting for him to bolt, to disappear back into the dark loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He didn't blame her. Some part of him was still tempted to run. But he stayed. Each week he stayed. And each week, it got a little easier. In early October, when the leaves had begun to turn brittle and red, Thomas received a letter from Mary. It was handwritten in the looping, careful script he remembered from their early love letters. She hadn't called. She hadn't knocked on his door. She had given him space, just like he had needed. But now, she was reaching out. The letter wasn't long. She didn't make excuses or plead for forgiveness. She simply told him that she understood if he could never come home, but that she wanted him to know she still loved him. That she always had. That she would carry the guilt for the rest of her life, and if the only thing she could do now was give him the freedom to heal without her, she would. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't cry. The grief inside him had long since crystallized into something harder and quieter than tears. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't answer it. Not yet. Work at the lumber yard began to slow as the colder months approached. Hours were cut. Paychecks thinned. Thomas knew he couldn't ride it out forever. One evening, sitting across from Katie at her kitchen table, he mentioned it casually, expecting nothing more than sympathetic nods. Instead, she leaned forward, excitement flashing in her eyes. "There's a position opening up at the high school," she said. "Maintenance department. Full-time. Benefits. They're looking for someone reliable. Someone who knows his way around tools." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You setting me up, kiddo?" Katie shrugged, smiling. "Maybe. But you'd be perfect." The idea sat in his mind like a stone in a pond, sending out slow ripples. A real job. A real place. A chance to put down roots again, however fragile. The thought terrified him. He had grown used to living half invisible, untethered. Starting over meant opening himself up to the possibility of failure, of rejection, of pain. But it also meant possibility. It meant life. The next morning, he filled out the application. The interview was short, straightforward. The head of maintenance, a thick-shouldered man named Carl, looked over Thomas's resume, which was little more than a list of hard jobs done hard, and nodded approvingly. "You show up on time, you don't steal tools, and you fix what's broken. That's all I care about," Carl said. Thomas cracked a rare smile. "I can do that." He started the following Monday. The work was steady, honest, fixing leaking pipes, replacing broken windows, patching battered lockers. The kids mostly ignored him, too absorbed in their own chaotic lives to pay much attention to the quiet old man pushing a rolling toolbox down the halls. Thomas didn't mind. He liked the anonymity. It gave him space to breathe. He fell into a routine. Early mornings at the high school. Evenings at the lake, where he watched the geese migrating south in ragged V-shapes against the bruised sky. Weekends with Katie and her family, sometimes Ben or Alex joining them. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for the first time in a long, long time, Thomas began to believe he could build something lasting again. Mary's letter stayed in his jacket pocket all through winter. He touched it sometimes, fingertips brushing over the soft worn paper, but he never opened it again. He didn't know what he was waiting for. A sign? A sudden softening of the anger that still flared up in dark moments when he least expected it? Maybe he was just afraid. Afraid that seeing her would reopen wounds that were only just beginning to scar over. Afraid that forgiveness would feel too much like surrender. Spring came late that year, dragging its feet through the mud and gray skies. Thomas kept working, kept living, each day stacking on top of the last like bricks in a wall he was building, slowly, carefully, around the fragile, stubborn seed of hope inside him. And then, one morning in April, he made a decision. Not because he stopped hurting. Not because he had magically found closure. But because life, he realized, wasn't about waiting for the pain to go away. It was about moving forward anyway. He didn't call ahead. Didn't give Mary a chance to prepare. He simply drove the familiar streets, parked outside the house he had built with his own hands, and walked up the porch steps that still creaked in the same spots. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately, as if she had been standing there, waiting. Mary looked older. Thinner. Her hair was grayer, her shoulders stooped. But her eyes, those wide, earnest brown eyes he had fallen for so many years ago, were the same. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. Then, without a word, Thomas held out the letter she had written him. Mary's hands trembled as she took it. "I read it," he said quietly. "I kept it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move to wipe them away. "I'm not here to fix everything," Thomas continued. "I'm not sure everything can be fixed." Mary nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "But," he said, voice rough, "I'm willing to try." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. A fragile, painful, necessary beginning. They sat together on the front porch, saying little, letting the quiet afternoon settle around them. Thomas listened to the creak of the swing, the chirp of sparrows nesting in the eaves, the distant laughter of children playing down the street. He didn't know what the future would look like. He didn't know if he and Mary could ever fully rebuild what had been broken. But he knew he wasn't ready to give up. Not on her. Not on himself. And not on the life they had, however flawed, however scarred, still managed to build. Because sometimes, love isn't about blood or perfection or promises kept without falter. Sometimes, love is simply about choosing to stay. Choosing to try. Choosing to believe, against all odds, that broken things can still be beautiful. The first few weeks after Thomas Reed returned to the house were tentative, careful, like trying to walk across a frozen lake when you could hear the ice groaning beneath your boots. He didn't move his things back and right away. He kept the motel room for a while longer, as a safety net, a place he could retreat to if the walls of his old life closed in too tight. Mary didn't push him. She didn't ask for anything. She simply made space. They met for coffee in the morning sometimes, sitting in the cramped booth at Joe's diner like strangers pretending at being familiar. They talked about the kids, about the weather, about the town's plans to fix the potholes on Main Street. Neutral topics, safe topics. They circled the real conversations like wary animals. At night, Thomas drove past the house and slowed down but didn't stop. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of Mary through the front window, sitting at the kitchen table with a book or folding laundry, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her guilt had compressed her. He didn't hate her. He wanted to. God, some nights he lay awake wishing he could summon a clean, righteous fury that would burn away the hurt. But what he felt was heavier and sadder. A mourning for the life they had built, the life that had cracked and crumbled and could never fully be repaired. Still, he kept showing up. Little by little. Step by painful step. One Saturday morning Katie called. "We're having a family dinner," she said, her voice careful. "Ben's bringing his girls. Alex will be there. We would really love if you came too." Thomas hesitated, the phone heavy in his hand. Family dinner. Two words that used to mean something simple and sweet: laughter around the table, the clink of silverware, stories told and retold until they became legend. Now they were a minefield. But he thought of Josh's wide grin. He thought of the way Ben clapped him on the back like he still belonged. He thought of Alex's quiet, solid presence, the way he hovered nearby like a sentry without ever making demands. "I'll be there," Thomas said, surprising himself. And he was. That night, he sat at Katie's kitchen table while the grandkids chattered and squabbled over slices of pie, while Ben and Alex argued over football scores, while Katie beamed across the room at him like a lighthouse in a storm. He even caught Mary watching from the corner of the room, her expression soft and cautious. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Thomas didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like part of something again. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real. And real was enough. Work at the high school settled into a steady rhythm. Thomas found a strange kind of peace in the routine, fixing leaking pipes, changing out broken tiles, tightening bolts on battered lockers. The kids barely noticed him most days, and he preferred it that way. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to be useful. Carl, the head of maintenance, was a gruff man with a dry sense of humor and a soft spot for bad coffee and worse jokes. Over time, a camaraderie developed between them, built on shared tools and silent respect. "You're not half bad for an old-timer," Carl said one afternoon as they patched a section of the gym roof. "Careful," Thomas grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Might start thinking you like having me around." Carl snorted. "Don't get cocky." It was the closest thing to friendship Thomas had allowed himself in a long time, and it felt good. Simple. Honest. Earned. In late spring, Mary invited him over for dinner. Just the two of them. Thomas sat in his truck for a long time before knocking on the door, heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped thing. When she opened it, he caught a glimpse of the kitchen table set for two, candles burning low in simple holders. She had cooked his favorite meal: pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Fresh bread. Apple pie cooling on the counter. They ate in near silence at first, the clink of forks against plates the only sound between them. But slowly, conversation began to flow. Small things. Safe things. Then, as they lingered over slices of pie and coffee, Mary folded her hands on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said quietly. "I know I've said it before. But you deserve to hear it again. I'm so sorry." He looked at her for a long time. And then, without really deciding to, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers tightened around his, tentative and trembling. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A beginning. That night, Thomas didn't go back to the motel. He slept in the guest room, on the same creaky mattress he remembered from years ago when Katie was a teenager and insisted she needed her own space. The house smelled the same, faintly of lemon polish and old wood. The floors creaked in familiar ways. The wind whistled around the eaves. It felt like stepping into a memory. And yet, it wasn't the same. It could never be the same. But maybe, Thomas thought as he lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, maybe it could be something new. Something rebuilt. Stronger, perhaps, because it would be built on truth this time, not lies. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if he and Mary could ever fully bridge the chasm between them. But for the first time in a long, long time, he wanted to try. Spring melted into summer. The town blossomed into a riot of green and gold, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and barbecues. Thomas mowed the lawn, fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen, patched the sagging fence in the backyard. Mary planted flowers, bright splashes of color that she fussed over with the tender determination of someone rebuilding a garden after a fire. They moved carefully around each other, learning new rhythms. Some days were easy, filled with comfortable silences and shared laughter. Others were harder, raw and sharp with old wounds that refused to fully close. But they kept showing up. Kept trying. And that, Thomas realized, was what mattered. Not erasing the past. Not pretending the pain had never happened. But choosing every day to stay. To build. To believe. On their 41st anniversary, Thomas found himself standing in the living room, staring at the old wedding photo that still hung on the wall. He remembered that day so clearly, Mary's nervous laughter, the way her hand trembled in his, the way the whole world had felt wide open and shining before them. They had been so young. So foolish. So full of hope. He didn't regret it. Not even now. Mary came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. He looked at her. Really looked at her. And he realized he still loved her. Not despite everything. But because of it. Because love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about promises kept without falter. It was about choosing to stay. Choosing to forgive. Choosing, every single day, to love again. He turned to her, a small, wry smile tugging at his mouth. "Happy anniversary, Mary," he said. Her eyes filled with tears. "Happy anniversary, Tom." They stood there, hands clasped, hearts battered but still beating, and they chose, again and again, to stay. To build. To believe. Together. The days that followed their quiet anniversary passed not in a rush of miracles, but in small, steady steps that stitched together the torn fabric of Thomas Reed's life. Mornings came early, with the groan of the old house settling into its bones and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen where Mary stood, half turned toward the window, waiting for him. They moved through a cautious choreography. He fixed the creaking front steps. She revarnished the kitchen cabinets. He mowed the lawn in slow, deliberate lines. She weeded the flower beds with a quiet determination. Every act was a kind of penance, a slow rebuilding not only of the house, but of something deeper, trust, wounded but stubbornly alive. Thomas took to driving to the lake on Sunday afternoons, a tradition that hadn't changed even when everything else had. Sometimes he went alone, needing the quiet, needing to hear his own heartbeat against the sound of the waves slapping lazily at the shore. Sometimes Mary went with him, and they would sit together on the weathered picnic table, saying little, the silence between them no longer sharp, but companionable. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a banner waved or a line crossed. It was built the same way love had been built in the first place, one quiet, stubborn day at a time. Work at the high school became more than just a job. Thomas found meaning in it, small as it sometimes felt. Fixing broken things had always been his gift, and now he applied it not just to leaky pipes and faulty wiring, but to the lives around him. He learned the names of the janitors and the cafeteria workers, the teachers who stayed late to tutor struggling kids. He started carrying extra tools in his cart, a little radio that played country songs too quietly for the kids to notice but loud enough to keep him company. One afternoon, a boy named Marcus, scrawny, with a mop of unruly curls and a scowl carved deep into his young face, caught him repairing a broken locker. "You fix everything?" the boy asked skeptically, arms crossed. Thomas looked up from his work, adjusted his glasses, and shrugged. "I try." The boy watched him for a long moment, then shoved his hands into his pockets and muttered, "Wish someone could fix my mom's car." Thomas didn't ask for details. He simply said, "Bring her by Saturday." "I'll take a look." Marcus did. And true to his word, Thomas spent an entire Saturday beneath the hood of an ancient, rust-eaten sedan, swearing under his breath and coaxing the engine back to life. When the battered car finally sputtered and roared into reluctant motion, Marcus's mother cried in the driveway, and the boy just stood there, speechless, until finally he blurted out, "Thanks, Mr. Reed." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Summer deepened into a heavy, golden heat, and Cedar Falls bloomed in the thick, lazy way of small towns with no rush to be anywhere else. The 4th of July parade wound down Main Street in a blur of crepe paper and waving flags. Kids shrieked around lemonade stands. Fireworks split the night sky into brilliant blooms of color. Thomas and Mary sat together on the hood of his old truck, a blanket spread beneath them, watching the explosions shimmer overhead. Josh and the other grandkids darted through the crowds, sparklers hissing in their fists, their laughter rising above the crackle and boom. At some point, Mary reached for his hand. And for the first time in a long, long time, Thomas didn't hesitate. He laced his fingers through hers, feeling the familiar shape of them, the calluses earned from years of gardening, the slight tremor she still carried when she was nervous. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the bursts of light. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "So am I," Thomas said simply. And he meant it. Later that night, back home, Thomas sat alone on the porch while the house slept. The street was quiet, bathed in the orange haze of the old sodium lamps that lined the sidewalks. In the distance, the last echoes of fireworks still rumbled low against the sky. He thought about the life he had almost lost. Thought about how close he had come to choosing bitterness, to walling himself off forever behind anger and pride. He thought about Katie's hopeful eyes. About Marcus's shy, grateful smile. About Mary's trembling hand in his. He thought about the truth, about betrayal, and forgiveness, and the strange, aching beauty of second chances. None of it erased what had happened. None of it made the pain less real. But it made the future possible. And that, Thomas realized, was more than he had dared hope for when he first stepped out into the dark all those months ago, the DNA letter burning a hole in his pocket. In August, Katie organized a small family reunion at the lake. Nothing fancy, just a few folding tables under the big oak trees, coolers filled with sodas, a portable grill sputtering bravely in the heat. Ben brought his girls, who spent the afternoon braiding flower crowns and challenging each other to races across the uneven ground. Alex manned the grill, flipping burgers with the grim concentration of a soldier on duty. At one point, as the sun slid low behind the hills, Thomas wandered away from the noise and sat alone at the edge of the water. The lake mirrored the sky perfectly, a seamless sheet of gold and violet. He heard footsteps crunch behind him. Mary sat down beside him without a word. For a while, they watched the water, breathing in sync, two survivors of the same long storm. Finally, Mary spoke. "You still think about it?" she asked softly. Thomas didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Every day," he said. She nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "So do I," she whispered. He turned to her then, really turned, and saw the rawness in her expression, the naked grief she still carried like a stone in her chest. And he realized that they were both scarred. Both guilty. Both broken in ways that couldn't be mended by apologies or declarations of love. But they were still here. Still trying. Still choosing each other. And maybe, he thought, maybe that was enough. He reached for her hand again, squeezing gently. Mary leaned her head against his shoulder. Together they watched the last light fade from the sky, and for the first time in a long, long time, Thomas felt at peace. Not perfect. Not healed. But at peace. And that, he knew, was a victory worth everything it had cost to earn. The seasons turned. Autumn crisped the air and painted the trees in fire. Winter dusted the world with white silence. Spring unfurled green tendrils from frozen ground. Life, unstoppable, marched forward. Thomas Reed kept moving with it. He fixed lockers and patched roofs at the high school. He taught Josh how to bait a fishing hook. He helped Marcus rebuild his mother's porch when it started to sag. He held Mary's hand at church on Sundays. He listened to the rain on the roof at night and felt grateful for the simple, aching beauty of it all. Grateful for the pain that had taught him how to endure. Grateful for the loss that had shown him what mattered. Grateful for the second chance he had almost thrown away. On his 66th birthday, the family gathered around him with a cake badly frosted by giggling grandkids, and Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching them all, their faces bright, their voices loud and messy and full of life. His life. His family. Not by blood. But by choice. By love. And when they sang to him, off-key and laughing, Thomas Reed closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, a chorus of imperfect, stubborn, magnificent grace. He had lost everything once. And somehow, impossibly, he had found something better. Something real. Something that had been there all along, waiting for him to choose it. waiting for him to come home. Thank you for being with us on Whisper's Secrets. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.